Well, welcome to my monthly podcast series titled Becoming a Sage. My name is Jann Freed, but you can call me Dr. Jann. In this series, I interview people to seek wisdom about living and leading a life on purpose. My passion is helping people find purpose and meaning in their lives on a daily basis for the rest of their lives, a concept I call breadcrumb legacy. I am also on a mission to retire the word retirement. We are not retiring, but we are moving on to something else. And I believe it takes time and intentional thought to successfully move on to what's next in life. Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Kim Cameron, who is the William Russell Kelly Professor of Management and Organizations at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business and also co-founder of the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship. He's written too many books and received too many awards for me to mention here. For more information about Dr. Cameron, please refer to the bio posted at the end of this podcast. Well, welcome to the series.
Thank you, Jan. Oh my goodness, it's so glad. I'm really glad to be invited. I'm glad to reconnect with you, and you're having big impact. Thanks a lot for having me.
Well, thank you. And once again, can I call you Kim?
Absolutely.
Okay. Kim was one of my sages that I interviewed for my book that is titled Leading with Wisdom, Sage Advice from 100 Experts. So you were one of my sages, and I've always been grateful to that. So thank you very much. Well, I've got a few questions here that I want to talk to you about. We want to explore leadership. We want to explore leadership during COVID-19.
Great.
And then I want to talk a little bit about legacy because that's my passion. So
fantastic.
Well, can you tell us about your work with the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship? Like, what exactly is positive leadership? How do you explain that to people?
Super. So many years ago, I was studying organizations that were downsizing, struggling, having a difficult time, sort of like where the situation we're in now. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered over about a 10-year period of time is that organizations that downsized almost always deteriorated in performance over time, later. That is, when they laid off people, when they consolidated, cut the budget, and so on, it created all kinds of difficult situations. I called it the dirty dozen. Mm. Morale went down, productivity went down, leaders got scapegoated, trust was in the tank, communication was restricted, threat rigidity response, when people get threatened, they get rigid, and so on. All those things happen. However, I found 10 to 15% of organizations that flourished after downsizing. And the question over time became, well, what's the difference between those that are getting a lot better and most that are not? Well, I didn't have real data, but the impression became very strong for me that the answer or the impression was those organizations that got better exercised virtuous practices or demonstrated virtuousness. Now, the trouble is that word virtuous isn't really acceptable in rigorous academic circles, but I really had a feeling that that was the case. Well, long story short, I ended up getting a research grant from the Templeton Foundation to study one of those elements of that virtuous activity, which had to do with forgiveness. Well, I ended up at about the same time I got the research grant, I also became the dean of a business school, and you can't do research when you're the dean. I thought a doctoral student might be able to carry on this work, though, and I could support it. At the time, no doctoral student would touch that subject. I mean, holy cow, it's just not legitimate. It's not scholarly. So after 6 years, I came back to Michigan, called the Templeton Foundation, said, I'm back. I can do research on the faculty. Will you give me a no-cost extension? They said, you're the only non-psychologist we've funded, and we'd really like to understand how this works in organizations. So it's a collective phenomenon, not just a single person phenomenon. So that was the research I started to do then. I never believed forgiveness alone would operate. The concept of virtuousness, I mean, a whole bunch of virtues together operate. And sure enough, empirically, you can't really separate them. They're most powerful when there's a bunch of things together. Well, I got to Michigan, and I have a colleague, Jane Dutton, a wonderful human being, who was doing research on compassion.
Mm-hmm.
He had discovered that compassion is also an organization phenomenon. Individuals can be compassionate, but actually organizations can embed that kind of a culture, a compassionate culture. And then my friend Bob Quinn, who I've been friends with since we were 21 years old, has always been doing research on, deep change and so on. Anyway, the three of us got together, and most of our scholarly colleagues thought we were absolutely crazy, we're idiots to do such a thing, but we cared deeply about this, believed it mattered a lot. So we said, how are we going to learn from each other? Because the default option for scholars is to go do something on your own, sit in your office and write books or do some research project. So we said the only way to make that happen is to form a center where we're gluing us together. We got to create something. So we created this center, and it's just been a wonderful experience, not because of us, but we hired a person who could run it, and students began becoming interested, and scholars from around the world started being interested. Interestingly, we formed that center before we knew that positive psychology was actually even a field. I mean, it was independent. It took us about 2 years to go over and meet with Marty Seligman and have breakfast with him in his home to try to figure out these two things were very much glued together. And so sometimes people say, well, positive organizational scholarship just emerged out of positive psychology. That's actually not the case, but they are founded on the same assumptions, and now much of the same research foundation exists to support both of those things. But positive organizational scholarship really means what happens at the organization level. Do organizations improve, get better, perform better when they illustrate or when they're characterized by positive dynamics? So that's one of the things we're studying is positive organizations, virtuousness, and a bunch of other things.
Yeah. Well, we're going to dive deeper into this, because I'm interested, and I think it's very timely. Well, I reread your article in Leader to Leader titled Five Keys to Flourishing in Trying Times. Well, we're certainly living in trying times. So you wrote the article in 2010. What advice would you give to leaders now during COVID-19? Is it the same? Would it change? I'm sure that you're being you're being consulted on this topic. So please share with us.
Well, I wouldn't change much. Excuse me, the notion of having things not go as you want them to go, that is to have, the prediction is that if we get bigger next year than last year, that means we're doing well. Bigger is almost always defined as being a better situation. When, on the other hand, we cannot get bigger, we're going to get worse. We don't have very many organization theories. We don't have much research on that phenomenon. So what we've discovered is in trying times, especially because it's so easy to focus on inconveniences, on obstacles, on challenges, on things that are going in the wrong direction, that's probably the situation in which positive dynamics are actually most important. Mm-hmm. It's easy to be positive. Mm-hmm. It's fine. I mean, I can be grateful when I'm rich, or whatever the situation. But when things are going south, that's probably the time when the positive dynamics are actually the very most important. I was reading an article actually earlier today indicating that, for example, the concept of gratitude is most powerful in its effects when it is expressed in the context of something that's going wrong or a difficult situation. For example, they've done brain scans of people who are under a gratitude condition. They've done all kinds of heart rhythms. People are just better for example, in a state of gratitude and compassion, generosity, and so on. That is in virtuous conditions. I mean, your brain works better and it actually works more efficiently. All right. All that said, it actually is magnified when individuals find themselves in a difficult situation. So the people who give advice about such a condition say, what you need to do is pay attention to what's going wrong and then flip your mind to say, what's the best thing about this situation? What can I learn about this situation? How can I move forward to a positive, optimistic future? And that unleashes, even to a greater extent, the power of all these positive dynamics. Now, all that said, Jann, you know this. One of the criticisms is this sounds like happyology. It sounds like positive thinking. It just sounds like baloney. You know, it's just not, it doesn't fit, frankly, with what I believe. Well, as it turns out, that's why the center was created, because this is a topic that's easily taken over by charlatans or storytellers or individuals who really don't have the work, don't know the work themselves, but they've read a couple of articles or a couple of books. And there are a lot of books that are published by those too. So what we've done is create a center where we said, this will all be a fad. It will all go away. It will not be legitimate unless there is empirical evidence. There has to be a serious scientific foundation and theory that explains why it works. The center and the colleagues here at Michigan and other places, including you, are involved in trying to make sure that there's some substance to what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. So really, you wouldn't change the advice that you would give.
I don't think so. I mean, right. The reason I believe this is one of the theories that explains why positive dynamics work is something called the heliotropic effect. Now, what in the world is that? So when you put a plant in the window, over time, it will eventually lean toward the light. Example of the heliotropic effect, which is defined as follows. Every living system, everything alive has a tendency toward light and away from dark. See, in nature, the sun is a source of positive energy. It's the life-giving force. So every living system has a tendency toward that which is life-giving. Nature would be light, and away from that which is life-depleting. So human beings are, in fact, inclined at the very core toward that which is life-giving. And that, as it turns out, is virtuous activity. That is, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. They've done interesting research on children ages 3 months to 8 months. Excuse me. These children are put in a situation, I'm sorry, my voice. These children are put in a situation where they're watching a puppet show. A puppet tries to walk across the stage, tries to climb a hill, tries to open a box. Then you have two other puppets. One puppet tries to help, encourage, support. The other puppet tries to hinder, puts a block up, you can't make it up the hill, jumps on the box, you can't open the box. Then, after about 20 seconds or so, you bring these two puppets out, put it in front of the child, and the child can select whichever puppet he or she wants to play with. More than 90% of the time, the child will select the puppet that tries to help rather than tries to hurt. That is, the conclusion of this study is from the time children are 3 months old, long before they learn civil behavior, there is an inclination toward virtuousness, toward, in this case, kindness, generosity, gratitude. That's been confirmed in many, many studies. One recent study just done this year, they took children 19 months old. Now, apparently, and there's some scientific evidence to prove this, at 19 months, that's the time, it's the peak, apparently, when children throw temper tantrums, are aggressive when they don't get what they want. They go out of control. So they took 19-month-old children. The experiment is a person drops a fruit treat in front of the child and a little tray or a little plate, and the person can't quite reach it. So the child can either grab it and eat it or give it to another person. when the person desires it, when there's some indication that the person who dropped the treat wants it, something like 60 or 70% of the time, the child will give it back to that person. Most importantly, even when they're hungry, when they have delayed one of the experiments is they delay feeding them, so they're really hungry. Then the question is, do you give this treat away or do you keep it for yourself? Most of the time, children give it away. They're generous, even at the time when I want what I want. Anyway, the whole point of all that is at the very core, at the very root of human behavior is a tendency toward being just, fair, generous, grateful, and so on. Forgiving, there's all interesting forgiving research. So the whole point of this, one of the theories about why positive dynamics work is because human beings are inclined, at the very core, they're inclined toward positive. Now, the problem is, we all know this, bad news sells.
Mm-hmm.
Bad is stronger than good.
Right.
Somebody gives you a negative piece of feedback, it takes a lot of positive feedback to overcome the effects of that negative. So there's a whole other theory that explains why that is, but the notion is at your core, we've learned our way out of the positive. As we spend most of our time on the negative now. But the whole point of that is we know that at the very root, if we can unlock that positive potential, things get better. Not so surprised.
Yeah. Well, I love this stuff. I mean, and again, it's what you kind of alluded to this, but it's kind of what they call the soft stuff, where the hard stuff, people like you get rewarded but the soft stuff, in fact, I had one of my sages say, well, it was Joan Gallows, Joan. And Joan said, the soft stuff, no, she said the fluff is the stuff. The fluff is the stuff. And I've always remembered that. Well, for many years, I used your book, Developing Management Skills. I used it in my organizational behavior course. And I think the latest edition, I was looking on Amazon, is it 2015?
We just did the 10th edition, so it's now 2020.
Oh, okay, great. Well, what I was going to say is, given what you know now and what we're living through, and, are there any skills that you'd either emphasize or add? I didn't know there was a 2020, but.
Well, that book, it's interesting. The book was written, it has 10 chapters and 10 skills. The trouble is that the students don't read long books.
Right.
So, we could add lots more chapters, lots more capabilities or competencies and skills, but nobody would read it,
Right.
or it wouldn't have an impact at all. So what we selected was some personal competencies, personal skills. The first, and actually it's built on a little bit of a theory. I won't talk about that, but it's built on essentially the notion that if you're going to improve yourself, you're going to become a better manager, a better leader. If we were to retitle the book now, we'd use leadership rather than management, because management got a negative connotation actually. But the book is organized into 3 sections. One is what we call just personal individual skills. So we start out with saying you got to know yourself. So awareness, self-knowledge, managing stress and time, and controlling yourself, actions. Another chapter on creativity, innovation, and those kinds of things, all having to do with myself. Then there's interpersonal things: communication, conflict resolution, motivation, empowerment, those kinds of things. And then there are organization or group level skills having to do with team building, positive change, and so on. The entire intent of that was, this is by no means a comprehensive list of what people need to know to be a good leader. But without these, it's going to be tough. There'll be some blank spots that will cost you. So we tried to do, again, research-based, tried to do an analysis of what are the have-tos, not all of them, but what are the have-tos that if you don't know these well, you probably are going to get yourself in trouble. And that's what the book was about.
Okay, great. Well, actually, because of that book, I did have students keep gratitude journals.
Oh my goodness. Fantastic.
Yeah. And so, Yeah, no, I remember that. So thank you. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit here, and I'm passionate about this whole idea of legacy, leaders' legacy. And how do you define legacy, and what does legacy mean to you when you hear that word?
It's a really, we had a doctoral student here who did his doctoral dissertation on legacy. And I remember some interesting conversations because on the one hand, a legacy has to do with what do people remember about you? What differences have you made? What's the contribution that's occurred as a result of your life? On the other side of that was, wait a minute, if you're only in it to make sure you get famous, make sure that people remember you, make sure that you somehow have a big name and a big tombstone, that's probably not the thing we ought to be doing, or at least it's not the thing that most of us would say, my core motive is I want to make sure I'm famous when I die. So the notion, for me, the notion ends up becoming something having to do with contribution. Now, what do I mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
There's a fair amount of research, which I like a lot, that suggests that making a contribution, especially when you don't accept a payback or don't expect a payback or don't care about or ignore, in fact, the possibility of reward, making a contribution is in fact the most important part in creating the kind of performance you want. I need to give you some examples. Yeah. I'm going to give you a couple of physiological examples. There are a lot. I just actually have been writing about this
interesting.
Last couple of weeks. So for example, there was these studies were done here on my campus. They took a group of people, all of whom were kidney dialysis patients. These people are hooked up to a kidney dialysis machine, can't go anywhere. They're measured on two factors. One is, to what extent are you being supported, loved, cared for by somebody? The second factor they were measured on is, to what extent are you making a difference in somebody else's life, caring, supporting, assisting them? Then, over a period of about, I think it was about 9 months, they simply measured the extent to which these people's kidneys got better, or their blood got better, or that is, improvement in physiological health. Those people who had high scores in the I'm contributing were far healthier than those people who are having somebody meet their own needs.
That is amazing.
It's another study of multiple sclerosis patients. These people have MS. Okay. Mm-hmm. Half of these people were assigned every week to receive a phone call from somebody expressing love, support, and concern. The other half of these people were assigned to place a phone call to somebody else expressing love, support, and concern. 2 years later, they measured 5 factors: self-efficacy, physical activity, hope, depression, something else, can't remember. 8-fold difference. Those people who placed the phone call were 8 times healthier than those people who received the phone call. That is, the contribution they made to somebody else, the well-being they were creating for somebody else, redounded to their benefit. Now, that's happened with all kinds of caregivers, widows, or supporting somebody else live longer than those who, and so on and so on. Anyway, the whole point is contribution, for me, is at the core of a legacy. I don't care if I'm famous. I don't care if, I just want to make a difference that matters, and I don't need to be famous as a result. So the whole point of contribution, generosity, altruism, all those kinds of things, kind of wrap up together in a legacy concept.
No, that's great. You didn't even know I was going to ask you these questions, and you've got great research studies. That's wonderful. Can you share a story that comes to mind related to you or someone else about legacy, or when you think of legacy, besides research, like maybe a story?
Sure. Well, I certainly know people who have just made substantial, significant differences. The people who, I'm going to tell you a story in just a minute, but the people who come to mind, and because we're involved in the COVID-19, The people who have changed lives who will never be famous are these frontline workers, healthcare workers, people who are collecting the garbage, people who are, feeding the population, and so on. I mean, holy cow, you can't measure the impact that that's having. So that's one sort of thing.
Yeah. In fact, I love the term. In fact, I'm trying to think of how to leverage this, but I love the term essential workers.
Yes. Me too.
Because they're often lower paid workers.
Right.
So how can we use that term essential workers to really increase wages and make life more fair? I don't know.
Well, that's true. It really is true, because having those, I mean, think about a mass strike by essential workers, we would all collapse. I mean, the world would be gone.
Yeah.
Let me give you one other tiny story. So it's not exactly on target, but it's close. So I got to know a senior executive woman who had a little child, 6 or 7 years old, who hated to go to school. She just didn't want to go to school. She'd cling to her mother's leg and cry when she got dropped off at school, and just was killing her mother, just ripping her heart out. She talked to the teacher of this little girl, and the teacher said, well, why don't you ask your daughter to just report to you the best thing that happened today? Just have her start thinking about the best thing. So the mother thought, okay, I'll start doing that. So the little girl came home and she said, what's the best thing that happened? Well, she said it was better, certainly, but it wasn't perfect. So she decided to change the question. The question was, what's the best thing you did for somebody today? Somehow that just captured this little girl. She was so excited. Mommy, let me tell you what I did for somebody today. Well, the payoff, this woman said, was they went to Disney World. They went into a restroom. There was a cleaning lady in the restroom. Now, they're normally defined as in the way, violating our privacy. I mean, just, they're bothersome. This little girl went up to this woman and said, I hope you have a magical day today. And this woman started to cry. She said, I have worked here 15 years. Nobody has ever said, I hope you have a magical day. The mom said, that's the payoff.
I'm getting teary.
Wonderful. What a sweet story.
Yeah, that is a sweet story.
Sort of what a wonderful impact.
Yes.
Legacy that created.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, kind of building on that is, how do you think this whole idea of legacy might change because of the pandemic?
Well, one of the things I'm disappointed in a bit is that almost from the outset, this whole thing became politicized. Mm-hmm. Because we're in an election year, it's because there's such division, partisanship. Almost everything is now partisan, which is really unfortunate. But when we have a crisis, mm-hmm. that's the time to come together. So I've been disappointed a bit.
Yes.
That has, there's time for partisanship, there's time for criticism, there's time for all the negativity. It's not in the middle of a crisis. That's the time that we're all together. So what I hope is that we learn some lessons from this about the need to be one, mm-hmm. the lessons to be learned, mm-hmm. need to be sensitive to, charitable toward, compassionate about things that are going on. When it starts sitting down, then you start analyzing and deciding who's right and who's wrong and who's, appropriate and inappropriate and so on. So one of the hopeful legacies is, as we go back through this, we'll learn that it's better to be unified than not. We're better human beings when we're supportive of each other. Mm-hmm. I hope that occurs. So that's one lesson, I suppose. Another lesson may be, it's hard to know, another lesson may be that there are individuals who have become heroic in their activities, and they're often like the cleaning lady, in the way, part of the furniture. I mean, they just don't get much attention. Mm-hmm. It warms my heart to have people out on balconies clapping or
Yes.
building lights saying, thank you, essential workers, and
Yes.
so on. So hopefully one of the things we'll learn is that, human beings are serving us in very important ways. Without them, we'd be in trouble.
Yes.
They're human beings that are really important. There are essential workers who are essential. I
Yes.
hope that elevates the stature.
I hope so too. I do. Well, our time's kind of coming to an end, and I'm always sorry about that. But what else should I have asked you that people need to know about leadership during these times? Like closing words of wisdom.
Well, I wish I were. Were wise and pithy, and I had the fluff is the stuff. I wish I had something like that. I don't. One of the things I think, though, I've learned, though, is that and I've been doing some research lately on this. Among the most important attributes of positive leaders is something called positive energy. What does that mean? That means when we interact with one another, are you elevating, uplifting, life-giving to me, or depleting, exhausting, a downer for me? There are several kinds of energy. One's physical energy, which when I use it, it diminishes. If I run a marathon, I can't do it again. Emotional energy diminishes with use. I have to have a break. Mental energy, I need a break, recuperation time. The only kind of energy that elevates with use is called relational energy. That is, when you and I interact with each other, it's renewing. It helps uplift us when it's positive. So it's an elevating experience. Okay, well, positive leaders almost always are also positive energizers. That is, they lift, they help, they are life-giving elements. We've done research on how to make organization change. Positive energizing is the single most important factor in having organizational change be successful. Positive leadership and positive energy are very closely related. And there's a whole nother discussion about positive energy.
Wow. Well, actually, one question I wanted to ask you before we leave here is, so if people want to know more about this, like I want to know more about this, what book, which one, you've got a lot of books, which one should I read first to really kind of get, because I know this work has evolved. So what would you recommend?
Well, that's a good question because, the sort of fundamental book is called Positive Leadership. But as it turns out, the reason I mentioned I was writing this week is that I'm writing the book on positive energy. It's not out. And the reason it's taking so long is that I'm trying to make it very scientific, very clear, very precise, grounded in a sort of undebatable research that talks about positive energy, its relationship to leadership. So next year, there'll be something out, maybe.
Do you have any articles on that?
I have yes, I do. Some short articles. I'll have to give them to you.
Okay, well, I can Google too. So, well, Kim, this has been great. I mean, you've given us so much to think about. I really thank you. And the emphasis in this series is on learning how to make the rest of life the best of life. So may the rest be the best for you.
You're wonderful, Jann. Thank you. Congratulations on such wonderful work you do.
Well, thank you. Now, thank you.